Welcome to week 18, Cornerstone. We are looking at our One House Bible in a Year series, and we are continuing this week through 2 Kings and 1 Chronicles. This week, we cross a barrier that few people will notice. As we move from 2 Kings into 1 Chronicles, we'll still be in the history section of the Bible, but we're coming to a different type of book. I want you to imagine books like Ruth and Joshua being written by one person at one time. I want you to imagine these next two books, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, being written little by little as events happen, and it's a book that's added to later by scribes as things go along. I want you to say, imagine it being written in that way, because we don't know for sure how they were written, but as you read it, that's the feeling that you get. When we get to passages in the Chronicles, we're going to read things like, this king ruled for this period of time and then he died. So that's how it feels. It feels like, okay, we're going to write up to this king. When that king dies, we're going to add that to it. And the new king comes in and we're going to say they started at this time. That's how it feels. So some of it reads like a purposeful biography, like 1st and 2nd Samuel feels like it was written at one time by one person about a long period of time, but it has a flow. Others feel like it's a well-kept log of events that were added as they happen. And again, that's what 1st and 2nd Chronicles feels like. So either way, doesn't matter. They are accurate. They are scripture. They are as God-breathed as any other book in the Bible, but it has that keeping a going log, a log as you go along feel to it. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles are what they sound like. They are a chronicle of events. Just like Deuteronomy was a retelling of Exodus through Numbers, these are a retelling actually of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So get ready for some deja vu. But first of all, we have to finish out with 2 Kings, and then partway through the week, we'll get into the retelling of these stories in the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So 2 Kings, we begin this week's reading in chapters 18 through 21 with the fall of Jerusalem. As we saw last week, Samaria has already fallen to a foreign power. As we begin this week's reading, we're going to see Assyria put their troops against Judah and Jerusalem during the reign of Hezekiah. This is prophesied in Ezekiel. We'll see that in weeks 36 through 37, which were written before these events took place. Again, the chronology of the Bible, right? And as we get to the prophets, it'll become more clear what that's talking about. These weeks are also described very vividly in the book of Jeremiah, which we will be reading in verses 32, 33, and 34. It goes into great detail about these few chapters. We will then get to 2 Kings chapters 23, 22, and 23, where we're going to get to a king named Josiah who brings a little bit of hope, but it's really short-lived. In the middle of all of this mess, Josiah, an 8-year-old, becomes king. He finds the scroll of scripture, which they thought were lost. Yes, the scriptures were lost, and most Jewish people didn't even know they existed for a long period of years. He goes in to clean up the temple. They find this. They read this section of scripture to this king. And one of the verses that is read to Josiah, we read previously of 1 Kings. So this week we're going to read about Josiah having scripture read to him. And in the scripture that's read to Josiah this week, this is part of what is read to him. 1 Kings 13:2 says, by the word of the Lord, he cried out against the altar. Altar, altar. This is what the Lord said. A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. On you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who make offerings here, and human bones will be burned on you. Imagine losing the Bible for a couple generations, finding it, reading it, and hearing your name as king prophesied in it. That's what we're going to see this week. It's amazing. Now, in the verse I just mentioned, and we've read it already several times, we've heard about this thing called the high places. We've seen a lot about them, and we'll see a lot more of them as we continue to read. What are the high places? The high places were exactly what they sound, geographically high places, like a hill that overlooks an area. And up there, they set up temples to pagan gods with pagan idols. They worshiped the pagan idols on top of hills called high places. This is something that was strictly forbidden by God way, way back in the book of Numbers. Numbers 33:52 says this, destroy all their carved images and cast and their cast idols and demolish all their high places. So the high places are temples and idols dedicated to pagan gods on top of hills where sacrifices were made to pagan gods. And you'll see several times where it says, this king did well, but he didn't destroy the high places. It's like, I'm worshiping God, but I'm going to let them worship pagan gods at the same time. And that never, ever works. Even the good kings, many of them didn't destroy the high places. And this becomes a problem. Now, we then now get to the last kings of Judah in 2 Kings, the last half of chapter 23 and 24. You'll see a couple more bad kings that come along after Josiah. Assyria keeps attacking. And the prophets keep telling the people to get right with God or this will go bad for you. And then we come to the last chapter of 2 Kings where Jerusalem does fall. And it falls in 586 BC. We know that date for sure because it was a big event. Records were kept on both sides of the battle. We know this happened. And after this date, 586 BC, Israel will always be ruled by other kings with two exceptions. There will be the Hasmonean era of 80 years between the testaments, specifically 142 BC to 63 BC. During that 80 years, they will have self-rule. And since 1947, they have self-rule, and that's 75 years so far. So aside from right now and a short period of 80 years between the testaments, from this time of history on that we'll be reading about this week, from all of that time, over 2,000 years, there are only two little times where Israel is not ruled by other people. It begins this week. All right. Now, from that point, you're going to turn the page and you're going to get to First Chronicles. As I mentioned before, the earlier books deal with both kingdoms, Israel and Judah. And this is now going to recap the events that we read about in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. But the difference in Chronicles is this. Chronicles is basically only interested in what happens in the southern kingdom, the two tribes called Judah to the south. Israel is only mentioned, the northern kingdom of Israel is only mentioned when it has an immediate impact upon the events in the nation of Judah. The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings appear to have been written before or as those events were occurring and were written before the exile, before they came back from exile, which we haven't yet gotten to. First Chronicles and Second Chronicles appear to have been written at the end of the exile before they came back again. We'll get to that in Ezra and Nehemiah. So basically, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings are written looking ahead to the time of being captive in Babylon. And then Second Chronicles revisits those events and rewrites them for the people who are now about to go in and take the land after they're coming back from Babylon. Okay, so one is looking back immediately, and the other one is looking back about 70 years later. Similar to the different ways that, if you notice when we looked at the Ten Commandments, the first time it's written is pretty much at the time of the events, and then later on it's encouraging them to go into the land. So it's a different emphasis. The previous one is about warning, and this one is about encouragement. So same events as 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, but those were written as a warning. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written as an encouragement that we can get back to where we were before. So as you go through it, for instance, when we get to the story of David, you're not going to hear about Bathsheba. It really kind of only talks about the high points because, again, this is to encourage. The previous one was written to warn. So that's what happens. There's a great article written by Stephen Bedard who wrote about this, and I will put the link to that article in the show notes on this so you can see a little bit more of what I'm talking about, because it is kind of complicated to just simply hear about. You may want to read a little bit further. So those will be in the show notes for you. All right. So First Chronicles, let's get to the Chronicles first of all. In chapters 1 through 9, you're going to see a very long set of genealogy from Adam to Saul. I mean, it's just simply going to be a list of this guy was born, then this guy was born, then they had these sons, and they had these sons. You're going to go through it really quickly. It basically gives you all of the Bible from Adam to Saul in 9 chapters without telling you the stories, just simply telling you the chronology and the genealogy of who was born when. Important stuff to understand as we put the Bible timeline together. But I'm going to tell you up front, not exactly exciting to read, but it's important for us to see the timeline. And then in 1 Chronicles 10 through 12, we will get back into the story mode again, where it'll tell us about the end of Saul's reign and the start of David's reign. So again, it's a quick encapsulation of what took a much longer time to tell previously. So all of that to say this, as we come to a close for this video and for this podcast today, this is another week to pay attention to context. In 2 Kings, we will see the end of Israel as a nation, even the end of Israel as a divided nation. And in 1 Chronicles, we will start retelling the story one more time. So we will end the telling of the story as a warning, and we will begin the telling of the story as an encouragement. It makes it for an interesting week because it's like ending one story that ends badly and then starting the story again, but now looking at it in a different light as a way of encouraging us. So that's what happens this week. It's a bit of, you're going to feel a little bit upended as you get from 2 Kings to 1 Chronicles, but that's why we're doing this teaching, so that as you read it this week, you'll understand what's happening. Because if you think it's just happening chronologically, you will get really confused. Now, at least you know we're going to restart the clock when we get to 1 Chronicles at the beginning of this week. Okay, so read that through. Now you have an understanding of where we're going to go, and we'll see you next week.